Russian forces have issued a surrender call for the Ukrainian forces in the Pokrovsk pocket, where Pokrovsk and Mirnograd are, which is what we've been showing you for a long time. Now, according to the map, it is physically surrounded, not just under fire control. And the question is going to be, will the Ukraine side fight to the death, as they have several other times when they've been in similar situations, or will they finally give into just abject reality and surrender? Those are the questions, because the Ukraine side had waited too late to finally make this decision. Russia now appears to have made it for them. And we're going to talk about what are the ramifications and significance of this is. Is it just one battle, or is this something that has larger ramifications across the entire front? And we have with us nobody better to try and analyze this than Colonel Douglas Macgregor, defense and foreign policy analyst, former advisor to the Secretary of Defense, and highly decorated combat veteran. Doug, as always, a pleasure to have you here. So let's just go ahead and get in started here. The Ukrainian side did not give up when before. There was an opportunity, Doug, and I just kind of want just from a tactical perspective, when you have the wreckage of Avdiivka, of Bakhmut, of the Kursk region, and several others that have happened over the other time throughout this nearly 4 years of war now, when they didn't withdraw when they had a chance and they ended up losing large numbers of people. When you saw the pocket starting to close up around Pokrovsk, what were the actual options that the Ukraine side has, and what do you pose now?
Well, I don't know when it became clear to the Ukrainians that they were going to be encircled and essentially cut off. So I can't second guess what the decisions may have been in Kiev, but my impression is
I'm sorry, have we lost Doug?
Yeah, we haven't lost him. He's just freezing up a little bit, Danny. So just we'll talk it through here.
Got it. Yeah. So what we're seeing here on the screen is some of the new video footage that's coming in from the Pokrovsk area, and you can see it's just being pummeled mercilessly. And now then we have in front of us the situation where the Russians are actually outright issuing a surrender option here. Now, they've done some of that in the past, but this one is one of the more poignant ones, and also one of the more large-scale opportunities where they've had potentially, by some accounts, up to 10,000 people in this one pocket alone. And this is actually different than the other ones in the past, like in the Bakhmut. Even in the Bakhmut, when they lost, by some accounts, in Kiev, I'm sorry, in the Kursk area, up to 70,000 men, maybe 50,000 in the Pokrovsk, they always had an exit. They never got completely surrounded. This time, it doesn't appear that that's going to be an option. And so, Gary, if you can pull up that full screen there. Of the
I think the internet connection is in and out here, Dan.
Well, we're grateful to have you back in. So we were talking about the surrounding by the Ukrainians in Pokrovsk. And Gary, if you could pull up that full screen there about basically the surrender option. It says that the Russians significantly increased. No, I'm sorry, not that one. The full screen that you had at the beginning, Gary. The headline about the surrendering. You can pull that one up. But in the meantime, Doug, if you can just go ahead and talk about, that they're saying surrender to save yourself. Russia urges Ukrainian troops squeezed into the city. You were talking before we lost you there for a second about you don't know where all the decision points were, but
I think Kiev is stuck by the notion that everyone should fight to the bitter end, to the last inch of ground, and if necessary, die doing so. And that has produced almost 1.8 million dead in the Ukrainian military. It has served no useful purpose. It hasn't changed the outcome of the war. But this is a sort of mentality that Zelensky continues to cultivate. So I think they just decided we're going to go down with the ship. Now, I don't think that's happening on the battlefield. In fact, within the last 24 hours, I've had people tell me that a number of Ukrainian soldiers have surrendered, that in most cases, the soldiers they were capturing were people, in other words, young men and boys who had been in uniform for a week. Just imagine that. picked up off the street, brought forward, put into uniform, and then sent into the furnace after only a week in uniform. It's absurd. So, maybe the secret agenda is to denude Ukraine of Ukrainian Christians, to annihilate them and kill them all. I don't know. I've begun to wonder, because that makes no sense.
Well, that's actually what I wanted to ask you, that because as I was saying just a second ago, when you look at especially the Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and the Kursk offensive that the Ukrainians had, when it became clear that they had done all they could militarily on those positions, and all the conditions said they needed to withdraw back to the next defendable line and to make it harder and difficult for the Russian side and make the cost higher to go up there. Instead of doing that, they stayed until literally the bitter end, where they were driven out of the very last house and building, etc. But they always had an exit. There was always a place they could go. This time, though, as the cauldron began to close off physically, the Ukraine side, they didn't give the order to withdraw. And so now then it doesn't look like, and tell me what you think militarily, that they're even going to get a chance to fight to the death, because now that the path has been closed off. And let me just show those people who maybe not clear on what the current situation is here. This is what's going on right now. This is as of this morning. And you see that now that basically it's been physically cut off. There's not many Ukrainians even left in Pokrovsk itself. There's only a handful on the outskirts, but all of those in the Mirnograd pocket, and then in this these fields and fortifications down here, those are still there. And I don't think that Russia's going to need to go house by house in here if they've closed this off. What do you make of it?
Well, historically, the Russians have left the so-called Golden Bridge for many of the Ukrainian forces they've been fighting over the last 3 years. And that Golden Bridge refers to something that Clausewitz talked about, that when you've quartered an enemy, don't hesitate to leave a golden bridge out of the pocket, so that if people want to leave, let them leave, because the longer you fight, the more likely you are to lose soldiers. Of course, that presupposed that you were dealing with a rational opponent who would then say, all right, fine, we lost this battle, it's time for us to talk. That's straight out of Clausewitz, but that's not what we're dealing with. The people in Kiev are not rational. So I think this time the idea is, look, let's keep everybody where they are, surround them, give them a chance to surrender. But we're not going to let anybody go, because if we let anybody go, it will fuel what little remains of the Ukrainian army, because there really isn't much left. More than 50% of effective forces the Ukrainians can field are in those areas that you pointed to.
Yeah, and in fact, I wanted to ask you that what the Ukraine side had tried to do, which seemed to make some sense, is that up in Rodinska here, which is kind of the northern shoulder of this, trying to close off the gap here, the Russians had advanced actually quite a ways up here in the past, and then the Ukraine slowly whittled that down. But they were really trying to take out Rodinska, because that's where Russia has the most direct routes on any of the routes coming in, even through the fields, to prevent any kind of reinforcements. But they haven't had a lot of success there, but they did send what appeared to me anyway to be their final strategic or theater reserves. What do you make of that? If that was the case, what does that tell you about the rest of the front?
Well, the rest of the front, of course, is crumbling, but more important, once you move beyond these, you move further to the west, you end up with more open, rolling, hilly terrain. In other words, you're leaving a lot of the dense forests and woods and swamps and so forth that the Russians have had to fight through with the Ukrainians. So there's really not a whole lot to stop the advancing Russian military from where they are now to the Dnieper River. And since Zelensky refuses under any and all circumstances to admit defeat and is insisting that everyone make a final stand, I think it's probably a foregone conclusion that certainly most of the terrain between the current Russian positions, particularly in the south and the southwest, are going to roll right up to the Dnieper River.
Which for our viewers here, that's this area right here. That's where that is. You see that Russia's already up to it in some areas. But
by the way, there are some of your viewers may not appreciate this. They don't know the history, but the Cossack Sich, this was the Cossack state that emerged in the Upper River Valley, back in the 17th century, early 17th, late 16th. Eventually, those Cossacks were moved out of that area, and they were moved to what is called the Kuban, which is actually on the doorstep of Central Asia. Cossacks that are currently living in the Kuban are talking about returning to their native soil. So that would mean that there are people willing at the end of this conflict to come forward and repopulate these areas from which their ancestors came originally. I don't know if that'll happen, but I think that's an interesting development. That tells you a lot about the way people in Russia think about the future in Ukraine.
Now, I want to continue going down the path of you talked about common sense and just rational thinking, because we have all those tactical situations we've just shown and where they physically are on the map. But there's some other things that are going along too, and that is mainly in the air. And there has been some additional information here recently where Russia has dramatically increased their air assets. And this is in the Kiev Independent just yesterday. Russia significantly increased its use of guided aerial bombs, the other people call them the FABs, against Ukraine in October, dropping over 5,328 munitions on Ukraine military positions in cities near the front line. In total, during the first 10 months of 2025, Russian forces have dropped approximately 40,000 aerial bombs on Ukraine, roughly the same amount that was dropped in all of 24. And we still obviously have a month and a half or a little over that left. Russia's air territory, or air terror, they call it, is intensifying. Now, that's you can add to that some additional information. This is just in the last day. This is what 1 day snapshot looks like. That's just the FAB bombs. But in one 24-hour period here, and this is reported by the Ukrainian side, by the way. This is not from Russian claims. This is Ukraine. It said there were 154 military engagements over 12 battle areas along that front line. There were 86 of those glide bombs that we're talking about there. 4,600 artillery and rocket artillery strikes. 6,000 FPV-type drones or bomber drones that dropped in on top of that. And that's on top of the long-range missiles and rockets. And then now there's Garand 3s. It's a new one that's been made an appearance here later. It's even faster than the Garand 2s, which were faster than the original Garands, making it more and more difficult for the Ukraine side to interdict them. The Ukraine side has talked about that they have a new category, to their credit, of interceptor drones that they had used to try to get these Garand drones. But now then, because these now come with a jet engine, they're faster and more difficult to have. Many of these FAB bombs, now then, they're going beyond the 80 kilometers they were kind of at the outset, now to about 200 or 150, depending on the variants. Some of those are supersonic. So they have actually 1,114 kilometers per hour. Bottom line is Russia continues to expand not just their capability, not just the volume, but also the technical capacity, making it more and more difficult. And the Ukraine side just can't keep up with this. What does that tell you about where this war is going?
Well, let's look at this from the vantage point of Moscow and certainly the general staff under Gerasimov. There is no reason to engage directly on a man-for-man level on the battle space, in the battle space right now. In other words, you want to use all of your strike capability to avoid unnecessary interactions with the Ukrainians. Ukrainians have no means of air defense or missile defense. They have no real means of striking back with any degree of effectiveness. So, why not just annihilate as much as you possibly can in front of your advancing force to avoid unnecessary fights on the ground? That's number one, because that means fewer Russian casualties. And contrary to what Zelensky and his agents in the West are reporting, people like Kellogg and others, the Russians have not taken heavy casualties, and they certainly aren't going to take any now. They've made that very clear. The second thing is that we have demonstrated conclusively our unwillingness to weigh in and stop anything. The president likes to think of himself as the leader of the so-called free world, whatever that means anymore. But he's certainly the leader of NATO. And what has he done? Nothing. He's done nothing. In fact, he's reinforced the stupidity of extending this war. He could have weighed in early on and simply said, that's it. This must end. We will not send you any more assistance or support. If he had done that, it'd be very difficult for the Europeans to continue to supply even a fraction of what we have provided to Zelensky and his crew. that hasn't happened. So if you're a Russian looking at this, in addition to sparing Russian lives, which is something you want to do, the second thing you might as well do is advance and keep advancing so that when this ends, and I think at some point it will become so painful that no one in Europe can deny the outcome. And I think Zelensky may suddenly vanish. He may climb into his plane and fly to Poland. I'm told that he's already made arrangements to set up another government in Poland. Now, if the Poles are dumb enough to let him do that, they probably deserve the worst, because that's something that he should not be allowed to do. He should have to face the consequences of his actions. He needs to face the Ukrainian people whose lives he's squandered pointlessly, as well as the Russians. I don't know what will happen. I doubt seriously that will occur. But there are all sorts of rumors going around in Ukraine right now about where he and his little band are going to go, because they're rapidly approaching that point where they can't stay where they are, or they're going to end up being arrested by the Russians. That's if they're lucky.
And we'll see how that's going to work out, because now then you have in the Pokrovsk and the Mirnograd pocket, they're now physically surrounded. Russia has issued them a surrender ultimatum, and then there is a similar situation developing up north in the Kupiansk area, where the pincers are closing in. They haven't quite gotten there yet, but they are already under fire control, so they have a similar dynamic already playing out there. Seversk area is also coming under new attacks, and then even actually two other things in the south, in the Zaporizhia area, there's been advancements also. In closer toward Kherson and several other places. And then actually up in the Kharkiv area, there has been additional Russian advances in two separate places, and they're actually starting to expand even more up there. It's kind of been under the radar because so much focus on Pokrovsk and the Kupiansk. But really what you see in Russia all across the whole front, to now to include either the Kharkiv to Zaporizhia, is that Russia continues to advance, and all the complaints about that they're going slow, it seems to slowly be picking up. At the same time, Russia's casualties are going down. How much longer can they go on like this, I guess, is the question.
Well, remember at the outset of the war, one of the things that was repeated and no one bothered to pay much attention to it was that Kharkov and Odessa are historically Russian cities. These are not historically Ukrainian. They are also Russian-speaking cities. Even after they were forcibly incorporated, thanks to Khrushchev, into this thing we call Ukraine, they were still Russian-speaking cities. So Kharkov and Odessa will both be part of whatever final arrangement is made. I think that's a foregone conclusion. But then you look, as you were pointing out, Zaporizhia. The bridge in Zaporizhia is in great condition. And Zaporizhia would allow you to rapidly cross, and you could move south towards Odessa or north towards Kyiv. Now, I don't think the Russians are interested in governing anybody west of the Dnieper River, but I think they've also finally concluded that you're going to have to deal with this regime in Kiev, and that means that you may have to go into it. So I think everything that you're describing points to that inevitable outcome. You're going to have a band of Russian territory, Russian-controlled territory, that reaches from, as we were talking, Odessa all the way up to Kharkov. And the real question is how much remains east of the Dnieper River that is not under Russian control. I can't answer that. If you're a Russian, though, and you look at the situation and you see our stubborn refusal under any circumstances to acknowledge legitimate Russian national security interests, then you may say, I don't have any choice. I've got to roll up everything to the river. It's a natural barrier. And for centuries, Kiev was the outer edge, if you will, of the West. It was a fortress of the Polish-Lithuanian Empire, or Congress, as they called themselves. So if you're a Russian, you say, well, what incentive is there for us to hang back? Why should we sit here and allow this thing to end? And then we still have to deal with the potential use of Ukrainian territory east of Dnieper River that could be a bridgehead for future operations against us. I'm sure these conversations are being conducted behind the scenes. But here's something else we've got to keep in mind. Everyone in Russia has been unhappy with the slowness of the operation. I mean, that's my impression. If I'm wrong, tell me, but that's my impression. Everybody in Russia, and I'm talking more than 80% of the population, says, go crush these people, get this over with, even if we have to march all the way to the Polish border. The man who has exercised restraint, who is being truly the adult in the room, is, of course, Putin. No question about it. Putin has always said, no, we don't want to precipitate a wider war. We don't want a war with NATO or the United States. Well, as a result, some things are now working to his advantage and to the advantage of the Russian state. Things are falling apart in France and Germany and in Great Britain. Now, there are problems elsewhere in NATO, but let's be frank. If you think you're going to get anybody in the Spanish army mobilized to march all the way into Russia, you've lost your mind. The Italians aren't coming. And if you tried to round up tens of thousands of people from Norway, Denmark, or Sweden, or for that matter, even Finland, to march east, forget it. They're not going to do it. They'll all defend their countries, but they're not going to march into Russia. So once you have changes in government, London is probably going to be the first major turnover. I think Macron will ultimately be ejected. Then the question is, how much longer does this man Merz last? So I think Putin has very intelligently outlasted his true committed opponents. And let's be frank about Donald Trump. He says a lot of things. An awful lot of what comes out of him is bluster. The Russians have learned that. And I think at this point, President Trump has said, look, we're pulling troops out of Bulgaria. We're pulling them out of Romania. I think we'll soon hear about U.S. forces being drawn down in Poland and Lithuania. I know he would like to get us completely out of Germany. This is over. In other words, this was never realistic for a country thousands of miles away like the United States to maintain a permanent position on the European continent. And he knows, I think in the depths of his soul, that Russia is not interested in conquering or destroying Europe. That's all nonsense. They want to do business with the Europeans. Now, they're very bitter and angry over what's happened, and I would be too. But in truth, over the long run, once you get governments in there that are populated with rational human beings, they'll be a real interested in restoring trade between Russia and Germany in particular. So I think the future is not as bleak as it once was. I think we're coming to the end of this, and nobody really knows what's the final episode. You know, I wish I could give everybody, this is how you're going to see it end. But it's going to end with a clear, unambiguous Russian victory. There's no doubt about that. And it's a matter of how do these European states handle it. And I think they're going to have to accept it whether they like it or not. And the current people that are in power will be gone soon. They're not going to last. And the new people coming to power are not interested in a state of permanent hostility with Moscow. That's obvious. Go to Germany. Look at the AfD, the Alternative for Germany. They made it very clear. We want to do business with Russia. We want to go back to Nord Stream. We want to get out of this terrible mess that we found ourselves in. They're not the only ones. You're going to see that elsewhere. So ultimately, I think this will end not with a bang, but with a whimper.
Well, given the alternative, I certainly hope that is the case, because there have been some events just today that give a new level of concern that we need to make sure doesn't manifest, and that is in the strategic realm. So you may recall, just kind of as a setup here, when Putin tested his Poseidon and his Burevestnik missile, this cruise missile that has a nuclear propulsion system a week or so ago, is that Trump came out and says, oh, yeah, well, if he can test his, we're going to make nuclear tests too. Now, there was a lot of question at the time, and people tried to get clarification from Trump. Do you mean a nuclear weapons test, like an explosion, or do you mean a nuclear platform test, which we do frequently? That's not unusual at all. And he wouldn't answer the question. Well, today, a couple of things have happened. Number one, we tested a Minuteman III missile. And so some people are thinking maybe that's what Trump meant. If so, that's good, because that's not uncommon. And that's no different than what the Russians did here too. However, in Russia, there's starting to be some concern about several things. And so the Minister of Defense this morning at a meeting said, actually, I think that we should test one. Gary, if you can put that full screen up there. This is from Russian media, translated by Google Translate. As soon as we pull that up there, I will read something off of it. That's the Minutemen that we fired earlier today. Then looking for the one from Belousov. Yeah, so this is what he says. The United States plans to deploy missiles in Europe, the flight time of which will be no more than 67 minutes. At the same time, Washington does not hide its plans, playing up the scenario of a punitive nuclear strike on Russia. And the Americans are not going to return to the treaty on the limitation of offensive nuclear weapons. They do not need it. Against this background, Belousov suggested that Putin not postpone preparations for a nuclear test for a long time, but to bring the Novozemlya test site into working order. Now, he's claiming that the Washington wants to do these things. I haven't seen any evidence that we want to do it. We certainly haven't said we're looking to do that. But this is what Belousov is saying, and that he wants to bring the nuclear testing facility up to full strength. What do you make of his comments?
First of all, he would not have said that had this not been agreed to before the meeting. And I think there's something everybody needs to keep in mind. I think it was the Secretary of Energy. I can't remember his name, but he confided to a reporter that the president didn't know what he was talking about. There is no requirement for nuclear testing at all. There are no plans to do any nuclear testing. And of course, if you turn to the Nevada delegation, they all went into hyperspace as soon as they heard this comment. President Trump has a habit of discussing things in public without first vetting them. Secondly, he goes into realms about which he knows absolutely nothing. There is no reason for us or the Russians or the Chinese to test a nuclear weapon. There's no reason for the British or the French to do it. We know they work. That's not up for discussion. There's no need. When you're dealing with someone who decides to test a nuclear weapon, that's somebody who aspires to be a nuclear power. So this whole business of testing a nuclear weapon is nonsense. Let's just forget it. It's not going to happen. I think what President Trump probably meant was something along the lines with the Minuteman missile. If he meant that, who knows? And I think the Russians are responding rhetorically to what they see as something that's potentially dangerous. But they've been dealing with President Trump for a long time. He makes a lot of these statements. That's how this discussion we've had today began. They'd make no sense, but are out of touch with reality. And that's certainly true when it comes to nuclear weapons. Now, what's the future of various treaties regarding offensive weapons? Intermediate range nuclear force. That was a treaty we walked away from. Thank God that President Trump has already said, no, START is in place. It's not changing. Thank goodness for that, because that doesn't need tinkering at this point. So I think the Russians are kind of overreacting, but the Russian people and the Russian government, I would argue, are much more tightly integrated in their response, in their thinking, in their mentality than is the case here in the United States. Most Americans are happy to stand there and let Donald Trump bloviate. They don't care. Doesn't make any difference to them. Only a few people who pick this apart, as we just have, say, well, this is crazy. Now, let's go back to, you were talking about the Poseidon and the other unpronounceable, supposedly nuclear-powered nuclear missile. The Poseidon is real. There's no question about that. That is a very dangerous weapon. I think the Chinese are working on similar things at sea. We don't need to go to that right now. But remember, they're also dual purpose. They can be conventional or nuclear.
Yeah.
This nuclear-powered missile, I've got a lot of problems with that. And I am not, I was one of these involuntary engineers at West Point. As far as I was concerned, when we were studying thermodynamics, I went to entropy quite early. I didn't like any stuff. I thought I was wasting my time in most cases because it was just another course with a series of equations. And the man who was better at solving equations than anybody else, he was number one. Okay, fine, great. Completely irrelevant to the conduct of anything in military affairs, in my judgment, but that's the old West Point. What I'm trying to say is that looking at this, I don't know how you account for the heat, the radiation. I don't know how you convert all of that into some sort of mobile propulsion inside this missile that's designed to sort of fly around for thousands of kilometers. I don't know. So I have a lot of trouble with it. And people that I trust who know a great deal more about engineering than I do have all told me, Doug, it's crap. Okay. So I don't know what the Russians fielded, but this business of nuclear propulsion in the air, I don't think so. I think it's nonsense. But the Poseidon is real. And I don't know why the Russians even need to worry about it, because the Oreshnik is a very powerful weapon, the likes of which we have never seen, and we have nothing to match it. But again, you're dealing with the Russians who feel they have to respond to every dumb idea and every dumb remark that comes out of Washington. I wish somebody in Washington, I wish the president would do this, because I know this is the way he feels. Just simply tell everybody, look, there will be no nuclear war between us and Russia or China or anybody else. We don't want it. We're not going to go there. It's out of the question. He could do that. Very easy. It's not difficult at all for him to do that, because I know that's how the man feels. I mean, whatever you want to say about President Trump, makes a lot of these offhanded remarks. He is not interested in a nuclear war with anyone. So let's drop all that nonsense and stop talking about it. And that's why the Secretary of Energy, confided, I guess it was he, I don't remember now, who confided to a journalist, forget it. We're not testing any nuclear devices. It's not happening. Let's come out and just say that's off the table. I misspoke. I was talking about missiles. Okay, fine. And as you point out, you can test whatever missiles you want to your heart's content.
Yeah, let's hope that's the case here. But in the potential for Russian overreaction, I'm going to show you a couple of videos here from the last 2 days from Putin. First of all, he's kind of listing this whole list of inventory of what he claims anyway are new and recent developments.
Russia, like all other nuclear powers, develops its nuclear potential, develops its strategic potential. All our plans for creating prospective weapon systems, for developing the defense industrial complex, and for equipping Russia's army and navy with modern equipment and armaments are being carried out. We have created and placed on duty and have begun serial production of the medium-range missile system, Oreshnik. In the current year, we will place into trial combat service, and next year, already on combat duty, systems with the heavy intercontinental missile, Sarmat. At last, Russia is acquiring the unlimited range cruise missile, Burevestnik, and the unmanned underwater vehicle, Poseidon, with nuclear power plants.
So what do you think is the real significance or the intent of saying that? Because as I think you and I have talked about on our previous episode, there's already a nuclear triad on both sides of the equation here, and this doesn't add anything that wasn't there before. Then why make this big production of saying all this stuff up front? What is the intent here?
Listen to President Putin's speech and then look at his demeanor. Did you detect any emotion? No, he was not emotional. He was very matter of fact and very businesslike. He was simply pointing out that Russia is taking prudent measures to ensure that it is protected against whatever might happen in the future. In that sense, he's looking at different options, and he explains some of those options. There's nothing new in that, except that we have to go back 3.5 years ago to when this war began. Remember, he went in with a very small force into Ukraine, thinking that he would then signal very dramatically to the West that they had gone too far, that pushing NATO to the borders of Russia was unacceptable. And the lights would come on in Washington and Brussels and everywhere else. Everyone would say, oh, wait a minute. We don't want a war. Well, what did he find out? Yes, we wanted a war as long as it didn't involve our manpower. And it was somebody else's manpower dying in great numbers on the battlefield. We were 100% for it because our goal was to destroy Russia. It was to remove him from power. It was to divide Russia into multiple states. It was to rape Russia for Russia's resources, which the bankers in London and New York City, as well as the crazies in Washington, all want access to. It hasn't worked. But stop and consider that for a minute. President Putin miscalculated. He did not appreciate the level of malice being directed at him and his country. He's not going to repeat that mistake in the future. So he wasn't making rash statements of, we're going to test nuclear weapons immediately, we're going to do this, and we're building more missiles than ever, and we can destroy them. The sort of bombast that you hear coming out of the White House with Donald Trump, or his supporters like Lindsey Graham, or remember this Senator Kennedy from Louisiana. He says, I think we ought to just kill all them Russians. Just kill them. What an idiot.
Very statesmanlike.
These people need to focus on domestic politics. That's where they know something. They know nothing about the world beyond these borders. And they need to shut up. The whole apparatus in Washington is unglued from reality. I hate to be blunt. And there is no long-term strategy. Everybody says, well, what are our strategic objectives? And I always laugh when people say, well, you tell me, what are they? This week now suddenly it's Venezuela. Was it Venezuela 6 months ago? And they'll say, well, we've always had Venezuela on the agenda. So we've been building, organizing, planning for the last 36 months to intervene in Venezuela. Is that what you're saying? Well, not exactly. The point is we have no long-term strategy of any kind. There is no coherence to anything we are doing. Ask somebody, what is our national strategy for scientific industrial development? What is our national strategy for high technology and its production here in the United States? What is our long-term strategy for the agrarian sector? We used to produce more food than anybody else in the world. Now everybody's upset over the fact that under Biden, we slaughtered 1 million cattle, a million head of cattle. What a catastrophe. Now we're going to buy it from Argentina. And why are we doing that? Is that because we like Milei in Argentina? We're wasting billions on him now? There is no strategy, none. And listen, I'm not just critical of the current administration. There never was.
Yeah.
There's been no strategy. Now, when I say never, you can point to the containment strategy. Everybody likes to talk about that. That's fine. And they try to justify the war in Vietnam on the basis of containment. But frankly, that's a stretch. There was no reason for us to go to Vietnam. Well, if we didn't go in there, they'd be all over Southeast Asia. What people don't understand is, listen, if they're dumb enough to do it, let them do it. If we are dumb enough to send thousands of troops into Venezuela, if I were advising President Putin, I would say, President Putin, why don't you offer a brigade of military police to the Americans to help direct traffic into Venezuela? I wouldn't stop it because the outcome will be disastrous. We don't belong there. It's not our country. What are you going to do, though? This is where we are. And you have the Bombs Away Club. It's always there. It's like this Greek chorus. When you studied Greek theater, you always had the chorus that would repeat things. And that brought everybody up to date on what was really going on in the play. Well, we have this chorus. It's called the Bombs Away chorus. Lindsay is out there directing it. Hey, bombs away. This is great. It's mindless. It's dangerous. But it pays well. People have enriched themselves with this nonsense. In the meantime, what's happened to our country? 70% of the American population lives, paycheck to paycheck. The numbers of people that actually have any money to spend, once you move beyond the top 10%, who's got money? Where is it? What can they do? Gone are the days when you could reckon at the age of 18 that if you graduated from high school and went to a trade school or ultimately to college, that you could reasonably expect to have a good job at the end of that process that would make you enough money to help support a family, buy at least one automobile and a house with perhaps a garage or some overhead. All of that is gone. And in the meantime, we want to invade Venezuela.
Well, and I'd like to kind of go down that path before we let you go today, because it's not just Venezuela. And right now we have a lot of combat power, fair amount anyway, in the region. But now that we have bombastic statements, not just about Venezuela, but also about now we want to start going into Mexico, into let's see, what was the other one? I can't remember right offhand. I just went, but one of the other countries down there, Colombia. And the question is, where are you going to stop? Because we're talking about potentially going into all these different places. Lindsey Graham specifically said he was going to get a briefing from President Trump on Venezuela and Colombia, and that he has authorized the CIA to go in there. Now, apparently, he's making actual plans to go into Mexico as well. Where does this go? And now let's just add Nigeria into this whole mix as well, down into Africa. What the heck, Doug?
Well, not long ago, there was talk about finally getting rid of this thing called Africa Command. And I was still on active duty when General Abizaid came across from the Joint Staff to talk about Africa Command. I thought it was a very dumb idea. How would we like it if the Russians or the Chinese or somebody else stood up America Command? I said the last thing Africa needs are more men with guns from the United States traipsing through the environment, killing people. They're doing a fine job of that without any interference from us. We should not be doing that. Well, obviously, I lost that argument, and everybody thought I was crazy. This means more four-star, another four-star billet. This means another big headquarters with a 3-star and some 2-stars and some 1-stars and more money and on and on and on. Congress loved it. Obviously, the then Department of Defense loved it. So we've been down this road before. It's crazy. It's absolutely self-defeating. We need to get out of all of it. But unfortunately, we're back to the bombs away chorus. It's going to keep us there no matter what. You're talking about Colombia. I went through the General Staff College in 88, 89 with a number of Special Forces guys, and they just loved their time in Colombia. They were down there fighting drug cartels and so forth. And ultimately I said, well, are you making any difference? And the truth was, well, this is never going to end. Again, go back to our original discussion on this point. The drug problem is inside the United States. There's the appetite. Our borders are not completely secure. Our coastal waters are not completely secure. We have not cracked down on the illegals inside the United States. There is no strategy or plan to deal with it. And of course, you have the opposition of the president on the so-called left. They want all these illegals in the country. They see this as a way to destroy people like you and I, destroy the American core population, destroy our identity, our culture, our way of life. Well, they've had a great deal of success, I would argue, with that approach. I don't think that's a good idea, and I don't support it, but I see no real strategy to defeat it. I see a lot of talk, and I see haphazard strikes here, there, there. Send ICE here, send ICE there. Wait a minute. What is the strategy?
Right.
What do we want this to look like when we're through? What are the resources we're committing to it? Well, instead of committing the resources to what's important here at home, we're going to commit them to Colombia, which we can't fix, or Venezuela, which we cannot fix. And now they're talking about Mexico. Go back and read what the American Army officers that went into Mexico after the Mexican War ended. We were there in that country for a year. And in fact, it's something the Mexicans don't like to point out. But as we were pulling out of Mexico, Mexicans came out of their homes and villages and said, please, don't leave. Don't leave. If you leave, the Mexican army will come back. They'll rape our women. They'll steal our food. Sound familiar? In the Euphrates River Valley in 1991? Down there on Syria? Oh,
I remember that, yeah.
If you leave, Saddam's men will come back and they'll kill all of us and so forth. We can't fix it. We cannot fix it. The biggest mistake we can make is to send large numbers of American troops into Mexico. Now, does that mean that we cannot strike at whatever we think is producing quantities of fentanyl? I don't think so. And there's not a great deal that the Mexican government can do about it. The president of Mexico doesn't control the Mexican army. The cartels do. But first, before you even countenance such an idea, you got to get control here inside the United States. I was in Southern Kentucky a few months ago. Wonderful place. I love the people down there. And I saw all of these Mexican restaurants. And I said, what are these Mexican restaurants? Suddenly everyone in Southern Kentucky become a Mexican food addict. And they laughed and they said, no. I said, well, what is this? Doug, that's where the cartels are laundering their money. I said, well, surely the police know that. Of course. And they all laughed. Of course they do. The problem is here, not in Mexico. We can't fix Mexico. We can't fix Venezuela. We cannot fix Colombia. To go into these places is monumentally stupid. I don't know how else to put it.
So let me ask you this in the last few minutes we have here. Yeah, look at this from like the top strategic path. There's this idea in the United States that we can literally do anything we want to. We want to dabble here, we can. If we want to dabble in the Middle East, if we want to dabble in the Asian area or in the European area with the Russian center, we can just dabble anywhere we want. There's never a cost to it. Whatever it costs is we can just play it and print more money if we need to, et cetera. But I know you've studied a lot over time, and you've been warning literally for decades that we could eventually spend ourselves into oblivion and destroy our own empire, as some call it. What do you see as the risk right now that by continuing to dabble in all these places militarily, that we could be undermining our own stability?
Well, I think that's happened. And of course, people talk about this massive influx of unwanted illegals. Well, one good way to resume that is to go into Venezuela. There'll be large numbers of people that can't wait to get out that'll want asylum in the United States. That's all nonsense. It needs to be shut down. We don't want to do that. We do not need more people who lack skills, who lack education, who are culturally alien to us, flooding our country. Just talk to Americans that live everywhere from Arizona to New Hampshire and ask them about who walks into the hospital and receives fully funded health care, drugs, operations, whatever's required. Illegals. People are not here legally. What are we doing? We should be concerned about helping our population first. What is in the interest of the Americans who are citizens? That should be first. That seems to be last. And of course, that's what everybody voted for Donald Trump to do. They all voted for American first. They didn't vote for Israel first. They didn't vote for more interventions in Latin America. We've been there before. They were all failures. We didn't vote for another war in Eastern Europe. In fact, nobody wants to go to war in Eastern Europe. It's insane. There's nothing there for us. We have no interest in Ukraine, never have. We wish them well, but there's no interest that requires the massive investment of capital and American blood that would be required if we fought there. This is just a kind of insanity. Now, we have to plead guilty as American citizens because we've let this crap go on. For how long? How long have we let it go on? Decades. We could have stopped it. It started with Reagan's amnesty back in the 1980s. Nobody on the right ever likes to mention that. Reagan's amnesty? Yeah, that was the beginning. And everybody said, now, this is the end. We will not have any more problems with illegal immigration. And what did we see? Once that amnesty was granted, illegal immigration skyrocketed and continued all through the 1990s. Now, we've got to sober up. Do we want a country? We're not. Because this is not the way to preserve the United States of America. This is not the way to have a country.
And of course, in my view, the real problem with all that is, and you touched on it a minute ago, in the military realm, but it really applies just as much, maybe even more so here. There's no strategic vision. Nobody knows what we want to accomplish. And so therefore, there's also no knowledge or even contemplation of what the steps are to get there. And as it goes, we just end up dabbling everywhere. I mean, do you see it any different?
Well, the government is sort of like a big pinball machine. And it launches a ball. You've seen that. It goes bang, 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 and then the ball disappears. And we'll launch another one. Bang, 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 bang. We lunge from crisis to crisis without any guidance per se, without any purpose in mind. Because why? Oh, the president says that Maduro's bad. He has to go. He has to be replaced. I think we've heard that sort of thing before. I don't have an easy answer, but I think at this point, the only thing that can prevent us from descending into hell completely is probably financial collapse. Because once it becomes clear that the dollar has been so thoroughly debased that it's no longer useful. And we are largely isolated from most of the world. And we can spend hours talking about BRICS and the emergence of a new financial system and the march to gold as the true reserve currency. Until we come to terms with these realities, I think we're just going to double down on stupidity. And I think that's where we're headed.
Well, that certainly is not an encouraging thing, but it is accurate. And one of the hallmarks of our channel here is that we are unintimidated and uncompromised to bring people the truth. Because if you don't know the truth, if you don't know where the holes are, then you don't even know what you need to address. And so one of the things we are grateful that you come and that you don't hesitate to point out things that need to be addressed. And we just have to hope that we can get down that path.
Thanks.
So thank you very much, and we appreciate you guys being with us today. Also, make sure you're aware. I know some people like to get their information via podcast. We're on Apple Podcasts, Spotify Podcast Addict. Type in Daniel Davis Deep Dive, and you will find us there. Also on the written format at danieldavisdeepdive.substack.com for the written word, which also includes videos too. Share this with your friends. Don't keep this all to yourself, folks, because a lot of people need these kinds of truths that we're sharing with you today. And we encourage you to share that. Thank you very much, folks, and we'll look forward to seeing you later this afternoon on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive.